Welcome back to my course, History of Socialism. For the past few weeks, we discussed militant, radical forms of socialism. We talked about Stalin's National Bolshevism in the Soviet Union. Then we talked about extreme nationalist version of socialism, National Socialism in Germany. Last time we discussed this Chinese Stalinism or Maoism. Today we are going away from these radical militant forms of the creed, and we're going to discuss the fate of the reform version of socialism, social democracy. Okay, what was going on the other spectrum of the socialist creed? If you remember, the socialist world, the world of socialism, became split into factions when in 1919 formally, when Russian Bolsheviks created so-called the Communist International. Okay, and the Russian Bolsheviks and their allies in the West, they claimed to preserve the essence of revolutionary Marxism. Okay, and they blamed their Western colleagues, the leaders of major social democratic parties in Europe, in the betrayal of the creed. Okay, so Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and others stressed that they wanted to preserve the militant nature, revolutionary nature of Marxism. Social Democrats were blamed, and rightly so, in revising Marxism, in muting the revolutionary message of Marxism. Okay, remember we mentioned that there were socialist reformers in Germany. Germany was the cradle of the organized socialist movement. Such names as Ferdinand Lassalle, Edward Bernstein, or in UK so-called the Fabians. These were the people who decided to remove the slogan of revolution from Marxian socialism, from socialism in general. So they wanted to argue that the way to socialism was to promote gradual welfare reforms and constant improvement of living conditions of working class. They argued, Bernstein especially, that capitalism wasn't bad. You simply needed to subject capitalism to the labor control. Okay, and in this case it would be fine. The marriage of capitalism and socialism, and avoiding this militant revolutionary message would work well for the labor. Okay, and the radical socialists were very unhappy about it. Okay, and that's how the socialist camp became split in so-called social democrats, Western European socialism primarily, because in the West the socialist militants, they were in minority, and on the other hand the camp of militant socialists, who were represented until 1945 by Stalinists, Trotskyites. Okay, and after the Second World War there were Maoists who also embraced this revolutionary message of Marxism. Then we have a bunch of African and Asian countries which we're going to explore. They also sided with the revolutionary message of Marxism. And I repeat, there was a minority of socialists, the left in the West, who sided with the same militant faction. But the majority of socialists in the West followed so-called social democrats. Remember, I also mentioned that before the Bolshevik Revolution, the expression social democracy was applied to all socialist organizations. It was a standard expression. But after 1917, and especially after 1919, when the world of socialism became split in two factions, the expression of social democracy was more applicable to these revisionists who followed Bernstein, okay, who didn't want a militant and violent revolution. And the word communism, socialism eventually became more applicable to the militant faction. Okay, so it's a very tricky here, because in 1920s, 1930s, there were social democratic parties in Western Europe which still spoke in favor of socialism. They said, we needed socialism, we do need socialism, but there is a different way to socialism. We don't want to embrace this helter-skelter militant project of the Bolsheviks. Okay, but Bolsheviks said, no, 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 you are not true socialist. You betrayed this revolutionary ideals of Marxian socialism. You are traitors. Okay, but gradually social democrats in 1940s, 1950s, by still arguing that we needed socialism, they started to downplay their socialist slogans, okay, and putting more emphasis on social democracy. So, and eventually, by the end of 1950s, the word socialism disappeared from the language of these socialist reformers, and they started to call themselves completely social democrats. In the ideal society they wanted to build on the earth, they called social democracy. See, they did not mention the word socialism, because the word socialism by the end of 1980s was not exactly a good word, you know. I don't know about the present situation, because right now, currently, we're witnessing a small renaissance of socialism in the West, right? But at that time, in the end of 1980s, the word socialism was losing its popularity. So that is why Reformed socialists, they more and more embrace this expression social democracy. Okay. So social democrats, they came to believe in a power strong state, that the state, by promoting this general welfare, could accomplish good progressive things, okay, which they stopped calling socialism and more call social democracy. So the rejection of Marxism was actually gradual. Bernstein, when he came up with his book Evolutionary Socialism, he didn't reject Marxism yet. He simply said we needed to reform it, but by the end of 1950s, almost all reformed socialist parties, like German Social Democratic Party, French Socialist Party, Spanish Socialist Party, okay, Swedish Socialist Social Democratic Party, which we're going to explore today, all of them dropped Marxism by the end of 1950s. So we mentioned the split in the socialist camp, okay. When the split happened, by the way, in 1920s, 1930s, some social democrats, they still believed that they could draw back their wayward militant comrades from the Communist International. So there was no general condemnation of the Bolsheviks on the part of social democrats. So half of them still said, oh, they're too militant, but they're on our side, okay? Whereas others rejected them as terrorists who spoiled this noble image of socialism, okay? But Bolsheviks, they actually condemned social democrats. They said they betrayed the socialist cause. I mentioned this. And another thing, interesting thing to mention, that in 1920s, in the early 1930s, Bolsheviks and their allies in the West, they actually labeled Social Democrats as social fascists. So remember, the left, the radical left, actually they very skillful in using these smear words, and the communists were the first to engage this expression fascist as a smear label. See, they routinely call their opponents in the socialist camp social fascists. So that's when the word fascism became a smear word, okay, an equivalent of Nazi. So today, again, the radical left, they use this word fascists and Nazi, as I said last week, as a smear word when somebody doesn't like somebody's views, you know, just in general. If I don't like your views, if I'm a radical leftist, I can say, oh, you're a fascist if you disagree with me, or you're a Nazi. That's a standard label, okay. So Bolsheviks and their allies were the first to experiment with this expression, okay. And in fact, in the 1920s, Social Democrats were declared the major enemy of communists. Can you imagine? They declared the war. There were fights, street fights in Western cities, in Germany, in Spain, in France. In Spain, actually, there was a literal war. But in France, in Germany, before Hitler came to power, there were street fights between Social Democrats and communists, okay, even though they belong to the same camp. All right, so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to pick up one of the Western countries, particularly Sweden, and I'm going to explain how the social democratic country develops, how one of the Western European countries was taken over by Social Democrats, and how this regime developed. Okay, interesting to see. And occasionally I will be using information from other Western European countries where also Social Democrats came to power for a while. Okay. Sweden. Sweden is a country that is located in Scandinavia, one of these Scandinavian countries which traditionally known as a country with a generous welfare state. Okay. The father of Scandinavian social democracy, or Scandinavian socialism, democratic socialism, was Halmar Branting. He was a reporter, journalist, and he was a Marxist originally, but then he read this book written by Edward Bernstein, remember, revisionist, who wanted to reform Marxian socialism, who said you don't need to go to barricades, okay, you don't need a violent revolution, you need the gradual reforms, so don't kill the capitalist cow, just squeeze the milk from capitalist cow, okay, don't destroy it. Bernstein. So he became interested in these views promoted by Bernstein and embraced his views. And also he read John Keynes, remember Keynes, the guy, economist, British economist, who argued that you need to marry socialism and capitalism, okay. Fabians, okay. So he and his friends in Sweden became interested in Fabians. You know who Fabians were, okay. In 1920s, Halmar Branting becomes Minister of Finance, okay. At that time, Social Democrats were not yet in power, but he was already appointed a part of this compromise which different forces in Swedish society were able to reach. That's what interesting about Sweden. Historically, a lot of classes in Sweden, a lot of groups were able to compromise. Amazing. So there was no irreconcilable violence, hatred of each other on the part of different classes. Like, for instance, we may find this in Russia during the Civil War when people killed each other, or in Nazi Germany on the eve of Hitler's coming to power, or in the present United States where the left and right, they literally hate each other. So Sweden gives us an example where people were and still are ready to compromise. Interesting. So sometimes they understand that they have reconcilable contradictions, but at the last moment they have been always able to compromise. And one of these compromises, by the way, which was very unusual, a minister of finance in so-called a capitalist government was appointed by Social Democrats, so they were invited to participate in the government. Okay. Then Great Depression comes in Sweden, and of course the results of the Great Depression were devastating for all Western countries, including Sweden. Okay, a lot of discontent population, and as everywhere in other Western countries, their perception was that capitalism was going to die. It was the end, apocalyptic preaching that capitalism was so bad, it's going to die, we need socialism. So all over Europe and all over the world in general, as you know from our conversations, there was a lot of interest in dictatorships. So people were very much in love with all kinds of dictators, okay, in this interwar period. So Joseph Stalin in the East, Hitler in Central Europe, Francis Franco in Spain, or mild, strong men like FDR in the United States. So perception was that emergency measures were needed to ease the crisis, okay? And the Swedish population was also embracing this mindset. But unlike the other countries, Sweden was not ready to give power to like one strong man, okay? What they were ready to do, they were actually ready to give a power to a strong, big government, okay? But not one like big man, like in other countries. And that's when Social Democrats come to power. So during the Great Depression, they come to power, they establish themselves as saviors of Sweden. And they embrace John Keynes' advice that the public debt is okay. So you don't need to balance your budget, especially in a time of crisis. You have to spend, give people employment, finance public works, okay, by borrowing from its own population, okay. Swedish Social Democrats came up with this slogan of people's home. For the first time, unlike other social democratic parties, so they were the earliest to embrace all classes of people by still saying that we're a working class political party. That's who they were originally, remember? Social Democrats. They positioned themselves as protectors of this moderate working class people, whereas communists were positioning themselves as defenders of militant working class segment, okay? But Swedish Social Democrats were the first to say that we in fact want to work with everybody, with farmers, with middle class, and even with so-called capitalists, okay? So we are not only the political party of the working class people. What we are going to build, we're going to build people's home, where everybody would feel comfortable, including the business people, okay? They called it folkhemmet. They said, and it was also a big breakthrough, see, embracing this Bernstein revisionism. They said, and they promised this, they said, we're not going to confiscate private properties, so businesses, so don't worry, don't escape. We are going to regulate you. We're going to regulate you. And another thing they said, and that's what basically swayed entrepreneurs to their side, they said, both capitalists and labor should be subservient to the needs of society. Okay. Yes, working class people are a big part. The business is also a big part of our economy. But essentially, we are not only working class and capitalist. We are all kind of people. So we are housewives, who don't belong to like working class or capitalist. We are handicapped people. Okay, we are craftsmen. We are farmers. So all kind of people. Okay, so let's make sure that the government serve all kind of people. Social justice for all. Okay, so I bet in the time of peace, it would be really hard to embrace this, right? For people to embrace this idea. But in the time of crisis, Great Depression, right? It became easy for other people to embrace what they suggested. We are going to build this big government that would serve to everybody. Okay, that was the slogan. What is interesting here, that people's home concept, it was building on, it was milking essential nationalism. So they appealed to the sense of Swedish nationalism. So we're all Swedes, so we have to take care of ourselves. Let's not care about what other people do. We don't need them. So we have our people's home, and we should feel like at home, like a family. Okay. In fact, the spearheads and the people who promoted this concept of people's home, they were building very, very much on German idea of people's community, Volksgemeinschaft. Remember, in National Socialism that was promoted by Hitler, it was a big deal. Nazi used this Volksgemeinschaft, so it means people's community. We don't care about other people, so let's build our good life, the good life only for Germans of all classes. So the same thing Social Democrats in Sweden suggested. They said, we don't care about other people, so we are going to build a good life for all Swedes. And the Swedes embrace this concept. The only difference here, of course, we have to keep in mind, in case of National Socialism in Germany, remember, Hitler writes, they wanted to build the security and well-being of Germans at the expense of the other people. So here, in case of the Swedish Social Democrats, they wanted to build a good life using their own internal resources, domestic resources or other resources, economic resources, primarily financing public projects through public debt. And then they were able, Swedish Social Democrats, to develop somehow the foreign trade. So Swedes had many items to offer for sale in the interwar period, okay, which saved the economy. Other countries didn't have. Primarily it's mineral resources they were selling to Germany, by the way, to Hitlerite Germany and other countries. Okay, so that's how they kept the economy afloat. The Swedish Social Democrats were building on the concept of organic state that was promoted by Rudolf Gjellan. It was a Swedish philosopher, a conservative philosopher, by the way, who said that one nation, it's like a body, like the whole body. Okay, you cannot separate it. So the whole nation, it's a working body, and you should take care of this. All limbs of this body should be well developed. Okay, and they shouldn't cut any limbs. All classes of this organic state should be working together. Okay. The major spearheads of this concept of Swedish model of this people's home were these two persons who became the symbols of Swedish social democracy, Alva and Gunnar Myrdal. Okay, Gunnar Myrdal, he was a famous Swedish economist. In fact, he later reached an international prominence. He became an advisor to the United Nations. Then he went to different countries, advising them how to build their economies according to social democratic prescriptions. And his wife, Alva Myrdal, she was a famous educator who also suggested reforms, how to transform education along social democratic lines. She also became famous politician. She was appointed as an ambassador of Sweden to the United Nations. So she worked for a long time as a Swedish ambassador to the United Nations. So they were very, very influential. So they were like icons, political icons, whose voices were listened to, informal leaders whose voices were listened to, because in 1930s, 1940s, 50s, they were publishing many books, they were speaking over TV, they were international celebrities, so their voices were prominent, especially at that time. Again, remember that that time, that was the time of newspapers, TV sets. Okay, so that is why at that time people very much listen in the West, listen to the voices of celebrities. Of course, right now we don't care about these celebrities. You know, I'm talking about myself because we're on internet and we don't know their names. But at that time it was a big deal because like in other Western countries, Sweden had what, 1, 2 channels, TV channels, and book publishers, and of course if you had celebrities, you had to listen to their voices. Anyway, in a such small country as Sweden, of 7 million people population, so these two became very famous. And let's see what they were doing and what they were arguing. What was their blueprint about this Swedish socialism, which later, by the way, they started to call Swedish social democracy, and then instead of the word socialism, they used word Swedish model. Okay, but originally both Gunnar and Alva, they used this word socialism, by the way. Okay, as late as 1950s, Gunnar still Myrdal, he used this expression. What they were, both of them, essentially created, spearheaded, was this welfare model. Okay, welfare state, the model of the welfare state. So how to build the welfare state in Sweden. Okay, and that's what essentially they became famous for, social democrats. See, I'm going beyond this. Sweden, just in general, Western social democrats became famous for building in Western countries the welfare state. Okay, sometimes it's called the welfare socialism, although Gunnar Myrdal preferred to talk about socialistic capitalism. That's how he called the Swedish model, socialistic capitalism. That's what we were building. Okay, and like John Keynes, he said we need to marry, we need to merge socialism and capitalism. We have to create this middle ground. Okay, interesting. Gunnar Myrdal, he was one of these people who didn't care about what people on the ground think about things. Okay, he didn't take into consideration the mindset of the populace. You know, he positioned himself as a enlightened expert because he was a scholar. He defended PhD. He was an economist, and he said that he literally argued that he was one of those few enlightened masters who knew the ways of the future, how society should be organized. Okay, he in fact never thought about, he was never concerned about the popular participation in democratic institutions. What he was concerned about was raising incomes of the people, how to distribute incomes, how to build the welfare state, how to distribute the wealth, That was his major concern. Okay, so he wanted to create these institutions about the wealth distribution. Okay, he put the majors, like many other social democrats, especially in Sweden, he put a big stress on economic planning and social engineering. Okay, so his ideal was to give power to expert intellectuals, so enlightened economists, sociologists, engineers, okay, business people should be in charge of the state, or business scientists. Okay, So basically, it's to some extent a return to this idea of Saint-Simon, Robert Owen. Remember the Council of Newton, when a group of expert scientists would be in charge and they would know the way to the future. So we don't need the revolution, but through the sheer mindset, through the power of the mindset, because we have all the knowledge, we can spearhead this good society, the regime of goodness. That's, by the way, how some newspapers call this project, which social democrats, particularly in Sweden, promoted, Gunnar Myrdal, regime of goodness. Okay, he said that if you read his articles, you will see that when he talks about socialism, he said, we don't need to romanticize proletarians. We shouldn't be fixated on working class people like these communists. It's not a good way to go. We should romanticize engineers. So when he said engineers, it's not only like technical experts. He meant, when he said engineers, in a broader sense, so which included actual engineers who plan something, architects, okay, industrialists, and sociologists, and economists. So these expert scientists, that's whom he called engineers. Okay. So obsession with the social engineer. In Sweden in 1930s, there were two major problems to resolve. Okay, the first major one, which all textbooks will tell you about, it's economic crisis, Great Depression. Okay, but there was another one which normally is not mentioned in textbooks. It's a decline in birth rate. Okay, so Swedes' birth rate was down, and there was some immigration at that time in Sweden. From where? Not from the third world countries, not from the Middle East like these days, but from Eastern European countries. Okay, Poland and Baltic countries. Essentially, people who belong to relatively the same culture to some extent. Okay. What they suggested, Gunnar and Alva Myrdal, you need to introduce a welfare state for the Swedes. Okay, all Swedes should be taken care of by the state. Okay, and we should exclude these immigrants. Okay, in fact, in order to increase the birth rate, that's what Gunnar Alva Myrdal argued. So we need to encourage Swedes to breed more. We have to promote big families. The state should provide financial help to big families. And they actually published a book inviting people to have more sex. The state should have more programs to help new families. Okay. And in 1930s, the Swedes actually, they came up with this fun expression. Instead of having sex, they used this euphemism. They said, let's go to Myrdal, Myrdal. It means that's like substitute for the word having sex. So it became like a staple joke in Sweden. Another thing, they said, they used the popular notions in 1920s, 1930s, when at that time it was in the mainstream, eugenics. So you have to sterilize so-called quote-unquote unworthy people. And that's what they argued in this book about the population increase. Gunnar and Alva Myrdal, they said we should sterilize so-called unworthy people, so lower class people, some mentally people. We should have this programs of sterilization. So we need to breed good Swedes. Okay, that was the message. Again, after the Second World War, of course, they tried to play down what they argued in 1930s, because in 1930s it was mainstream. Remember, Hitler's National Socialists, they were talking like this in the United States. The progressives were having the same conversation about social engineering, eugenics. Okay. Alva also became famous for promoting social engineering and education. Okay. She was one of the spearheads of collective housing, so-called collective housing. So the Swedes needed more projects, okay, which would help to give good apartments to everybody. So that's how the project housing was emerging at that time in Sweden, to give each family at least a small studio type apartment. Okay. And one of her major pet projects, I'm talking about Alva Myrdal, was transforming the Swedish education. So she invested a lot of time and energy into this project. She wrote books, articles, gave interviews about it. What essentially she said, that we need to reduce parenting and we should increase the state involvement in education. She actually argued that in the kindergarten you should break this bond between parents and children, because not all parents are good. So they infect the people, that's what she argued, kids' minds with these ideas of individualism, capitalist individualism. They infest their minds with competitive spirit. But if you put children in state-run kindergartens, they will be taken care of by the state, and they would be educated in the spirit of collectivism, in the spirit of loyalty to the state that takes care of them. So that was her suggestion, that was her recommendation. So the same with schools. She said when young kids from kindergarten, they graduate and go into regular schools, elementary schools, junior schools, so it would be easy to work with them, because they already received this re-education in kindergartens. Okay, they would become good citizens of the state. And that's her suggestion, that state-run schools should be also promoted. No private schooling, because again it's bad, she argued, because private schooling would increase the spirit of individualism. So her suggestion was to promote state-run schools. Another important part of the Swedish model was taking advantage of the war situation. I mentioned a few times about how important this warfare factor was, both in the wake of the First World War, during the Second World War, and in the wake of the Second World War. So how warfare directly and indirectly encouraged the spirit of mobilization, the spirit of regulation, the spirit of social engineering. And that's what both Gunnar Alva Myrdal and other social democrats in other countries embraced. They said, it's good that we have a war against, strange as it may sound. That's what they said. It's a bad thing, of course, the war, but it's a good thing, because the war would allow us to mobilize society and to force society to accept things which in a time of peace they would not wish to accept. Okay, what Myrdals and other social democrats in other Western European countries argued, they said war would help to create the sense of community. Okay. In England, for example, remember England was bombed by the Germans since 1940. The Labour minister in UK. He actually said, yes, it's bad bombing, but at the same time, we developed during the war the sense of community, which would make it easy for the state to promote state-sponsored welfare. And he started arguing this as early as 1941. Okay. In fact, in UK, they created the Committee of Civil Servants, headed by Lord William Beveridge, okay, who worked for London School of Economics, who wrote so-called the Beveridge Report. It's a very important document. In UK, it laid the foundations for the welfare state, and other Western European countries, other social democrats embraced it too, including Myrdals and other Swedish social democrats. Okay. The Beveridge Report, which was praised by Myrdals, argued that we need freedom from want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. And the Beveridge Report said we need to provide total employment at the expense of the state. Okay. Again, war was used as a good excuse to build on. Okay. Unfortunate thing that in the eyes of social democrats turned out to be good to mobilize people for a greater good. Okay. A war showed that centralized planning was needed to accomplish socially useful tasks. Okay. A war removed brakes from the productive machinery and ensured full use of the nation's resources and labor, unquote. See, I'm quoting from the group of Scandinavian social democrats who studied their own experience, who looked at UK. And during the Second World War, these social democrats, Scandinavian social democrats, Norwegians, Swedes, Danish people, they issued this statement. And interesting, see the third bullet point, another quote from this statement of Scandinavian social democrats. If the angels are not ready to fill the empty space immediately when the war is over, the fools or even more dangerous elements will be there first, unquote. See, it was like invitation for a state to come and fill this void, right? When I was doing my research, I finished my book on the history of socialism this spring, and when I was doing my research, I read memoirs of man named Straight, Michael Straight, who was socialist fellow traveler, one of the Soviet fellow travelers who actually became a spy for the Soviet Union. And in his memoirs, I found this interesting quotation. His brother of this guy, Michael Straight, was a witness Straight, and he was UK Royal Air Force pilot. Okay. An American who lived in Britain, became anglicized, and eventually became a Royal Air Force pilot. So they exchanged letters. And in March 1941, witness Straight writes to his brother, this Soviet fellow traveler, Michael Straight. Interesting letter, right? Again, this quote I purposely decided to give you to show how the war actually helped the Western European social democrats to promote this spirit of mobilization. Okay, that eased them to create this big welfare state, social engineering from up above. We have beaten Germans in the air by day, and we will shortly do the same by night. The bombing has been bad, but it will be fun to rebuilding. London will be the finest, most efficient, most beautiful city in the world, mark my words. You will see a pretty good social system. War is a great equalizer, and people want peace to stay that way. We shall have a truly socialist state, unquote. Very interesting statement, right? Okay. When the war was over, we could observe in all Western European countries a big tectonic shift toward the left, social democratic left. The post-war era from roughly 1945 to the very end of 1960s, it was the golden days of social democracy. Golden days of the social democracy. So during these years, the large welfare state became a norm. It was embraced by everybody. Not only, it became the consensus. It was embraced not only by social democrats, but many people on the right. So moderate conservatives or mainstream conservatives. And let me just give you a few quotes. When I was coming for this lecture, I decided to copy some of this stuff. I found these random quotes. For example, Norwegian, Labour politician Einar Ford threw this phrase in 1950s. We are all social democrats. So he meant both mainstream conservatives and social democrats. Richard Nixon, remember? Republican president. 1971. He said, I'm now a Keynesian. I'm now a Keynesian. So Keynesian means social democrat. So he resorted to social democratic measures, and he was promoting a lot of social democratic reforms. Of course, in the United States, they were not called this name. They use different expression. Okay, either they call progressive reforms. Okay, or on the different names. Welfare socialism, what social democrats promoted in the West, capitalized on unending economic growth. So there was a lot of economic growth in the post-war Europe, especially when American money came to Europe, $155 billion. It kind of injected a lot of money, and European economies were growing. At the same time, the market was still maintained, wasn't squashed, so it was like a marriage, what they were talking about, social democrats, the marriage of socialism and capitalism. And for a while, it did contribute to a tremendous economic growth. And social democracy came to power in Sweden, for instance, in 1932, and stayed in power until 1976. In UK, social democrats come to power. Again, in UK, like in the United States, they are not called social democrats. We are talking in UK about the Labour Party. Okay, so the Labour Party comes to power in 1945. In 1951, so that's when Labourites, English democratic socialists, were in power. In fact, in England, Labourites, when they came to power in 1945, they actually said, we want to build socialism. See, unlike Swedish social democrats who were talking, who kind of muted this talk about socialism, they, in 1940s, 1950s, Gunnar Myrdal, Alva Myrdal, other social democrats, they occasionally did write that, oh, we like socialism, but they never said about socialism in their open political statements. What they said, that we need social democracy. But here in England in 1945, we actually have politicians who said we want to build democratic socialism. Okay, and for the first time in modern British history, overwhelming majority of people actually opted for this democratic socialism. It was a big victory for the Labour Party over conservatives. So Winston Churchill, who actually presided over England during the Second World War, he lost to the Labour Party, and with large majority of votes, socialists, Labourites came to power. So here you can see one of the major UK newspapers, Evening Standard issue with this editorial published next day after Social Democrats of UK came to power. Clement Atlee, whose picture you just saw on this newspaper editorial, Clement Atlee became the prime minister, okay, who was actually a person who converted from Christianity. He was a die-hard Christian, who at some point converted to socialism. He also, like many other prominent British politicians on the left, he belonged to the Fabian Society. Remember, it was the elite society that didn't accept everybody into its rank. Remember, requirement was that you had to be a prominent member of society, a respected member of society, in agreement with this stealth democratic socialism. Okay, so he was the member of the society. He was fascinated with the Swedish example, Clement Atlee. So there was cross-fertilization between Swedish Social Democrats and UK labor rights or socialists. In this book I gave you to read by Moravchik, on page 183, you can actually find good revealing quotations from Clement Atlee about war economy, how war economy was good. Okay, so he said the war was blessing. On the one hand, of course, it was bad, a lot of people died, but on the other hand, I repeat, people like Clement Atlee, Gunnar Myrdal, Alva Myrdal, they viewed war as the great blessing that could eradicate the spirit of individualism, okay, and empower a strong state to create the sense of community, which would ease, after the war, the efforts of the Social Democrats to mobilize people to build this great future. Okay, so anyway, in UK, Clement Atlee put the Beveridge Report to practice. Okay, and as I said, in contrast to the Swedish colleagues, he openly advocated socialism, that we need democratic socialism. In fact, I quote him, "Our goal, not a reformed capitalism." That's what Gunnar Myrdal actually argued when he was speaking publicly. But democratic socialism, that's what Clement Atlee insisted on. So he actually argued that British labor rights should nationalize mines, the Bank of England, and they did it. See, in Sweden, they didn't do it. They talked about regulation, but in UK, this government that was in power, Labour government, from 1945 to 1951, they actually nationalized coal mines, they nationalized all railroad, they nationalized Bank of England, they nationalized municipal housing. Okay. Clement Atlee said, "We do need to tolerate small enterprises for a while, but in future we might even nationalize small enterprises." See, that's interesting. In UK, okay. At the same time, labor rights in UK, since they had majority in the British Parliament, they were able to railroad the National Insurance Act, so to give people insurance, unemployment insurance, public housing, as I said, municipal housing that was to be owned by the state or local municipalities. Universal education became free. Not only public education, but also college education became free in UK. Okay. But unfortunately, I have to mention something, unfortunate thing. Soon, labor rights, Clement Atlee government ran out of money, since they were giving this generous subsidies, educational subsidies, and free healthcare, by the way, was also introduced, I want to emphasize. So soon they ran out of money, and they started to print money, so promoted inflation. And in fact, a year later, 1946, they had to introduce rationing, so that existed during the war, but after the war it was abandoned, rationing of food. So people started coming to the stores, buying food by using money. But since the situation a year later became so desperate because of these reforms promoted by labor rights, they had to again introduce rationing of bread. Fortunately, American money came to UK. You probably heard about so-called Marshall Plan. George Marshall was the Secretary of State who said that we need to pump billions of dollars in Europe to make sure that dictatorships wouldn't come. If people are poor, it would ease the efforts of Soviet Union to recruit their political allies. So the rationale was very simple. Before 1945, it was Hitler, National Socialism, that was the major danger. So we defeated this danger. But now it would be the Soviets who would come and exploit the situation if people still lived a desperate life, if they didn't have enough to eat, if unemployment was too high. So the Soviets would come and they capitalized on the situation, and people would vote not only Social Democrats, these reform socialists, but they would vote communists. And there was actually a reason to believe this, because in two countries, France and Italy, communist parties became so popular and influential that in fact there were more communists at some point than Social Democrats. In Italy, for instance, the Communist Party had more members than the Socialist Party. Okay. In France, communists were fewer than socialists, but still it was a large majority. They almost, in terms of popularity, they were almost kind of going neck by neck. So that is why Soviets did gamble on these two movements, communist movements in France and Italy, to kind of spearhead communism. And of course, the fear of the United States was that Social Democrats might somehow get united with communists, and together they would win over Western European countries. So George Marshall came up with this Marshall Plan that the American government should provide credits to Western European governments in the countries which were devastated by the Second World War. Plus, American companies were given a tax credit, tax breaks, if they went to Western Europe to invest into local economies. Okay, so it was also good for American companies. So, to make a long story short, from 1947 to 1955, almost $155 billion came to Europe. And it did help, in this case, UK, to survive, okay, because this socialist government was running out of money. Okay, interesting. During these years, socialist government that was in charge of Britain started to promote this idea that Brits should get rid of their colonies, because colonies, it was like an albatross on the neck of the state. And that's when the British government decided to peacefully transfer power to local national elites in Asia and Africa, India, Tanzania, you name them, Zambia, okay, a bunch of English colonies. Okay, the government, socialist government, made the first step to get rid of the colonial empire. Okay, that was a good thing, obviously. But at the same time, this socialist government tried to promote in these former colonies which were receiving independence, like India in 1947, Tanzania later, they were promoting the socialist reforms, okay, since the mother country tried to experiment with socialism. But unfortunately, I repeat, this shortage of money forced this government of Clement Atlee, despite the American financial help, there was still not enough to fund the generous welfare programs, and the socialist government had to cut public spendings to some extent in 1949. And in fact, the situation was still so bad that in 1951 they already lost the power, okay, because they screwed up in this case. But again, Clement Atlee didn't give up. He believed that as a religious person who converted to socialism, socialism became, again, the reason I'm mentioning this is to tell you that socialism, democratic socialism, became for him as a new religion, a new creed. And in 1951, when he was defeated, when eventually they lost the power, labor rights, conservatives came to power, he was unrepentant, and he famously said while stepping down, quote, "I will not cease from mental fight, not shall sword sleep in my hand till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land," unquote. See, it's a profoundly a spiritual message, okay? I'll keep this in mind. So, talking about UK, talking about Sweden, what were the benefits of European welfare state? First of all, access to free kindergarten. So, parents in European countries at that time and to the present day, they are not concerned about where to send the kids. So, they have free kindergarten services, free schooling, of course, public schooling. Okay. And unlike the United States, college education is totally free in Sweden, UK, Norway, France, Germany. Okay, you do have to pay some small registration fees, but still it's totally free. Unlike the United States. Okay, and there's still debates, of course, in Europe to the present day, especially in 1970s, 1980s, when the welfare state, I'm going to explore this, started to crumble. So people were talking about this free education, but still it's free. Okay, and majority of society in Europe likes it. Free healthcare, very inefficient in some countries, but still free basic care. You have to wait in a long line. Okay, but it's free sometimes, especially if you need serious surgeries. You might die because you're on the waiting list. But minor things, it's very accessible. You know, you don't have to pay if it's you broke your leg, if it's emergency situation. Okay, like ambulance. So you're taking to a hospital, you don't have to pay. So minor injuries, minor problems, everything is free, everything is covered. So in this case, people shouldn't break their heads over how to pay for things. Okay. But I repeat, at that time everybody was very happy about this at that time. But nowadays in UK and some European countries, they do question this free healthcare system. Not everybody, half of society loves it. Okay, so we have to be fair to say that the majority, in fact, in Sweden, in Germany, in UK, majority of people are happy with the state of things. Okay. In some countries, a welfare state introduced unlimited welfare benefits. So, like for instance, in the United States, you know that there's a limit when you can receive unemployment benefits. But in Sweden, for instance, I'm not sure about UK, but in Sweden, Social Democrats introduced unlimited unemployment benefits. In Germany, I think they do exist. So you can claim them essentially forever if you don't want to work. You know, if you don't have any ambitions, you can exist on some kind of minimum minimum income. Okay, so you will have enough to eat, and that's it. What was the major source of revenue for this welfare state that was promoted by European Social Democrats? The major revenue was a large, huge progressive tax on everybody. On everybody. Okay. In Sweden, at some point, for example, this tax reached 75% of your check. You know, that's pretty high, right? Let's talk briefly about Nordic welfare state, the Scandinavian model. Okay, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland. Frequently, in the present day left community, people talk about the success of Nordic welfare states. So let's look into the sources of this welfare state, and particularly Sweden. Okay. First, unlike such countries like UK, France, Italy, Spain, which are very stagnant countries, so economies were very stagnant there as early as 1960s, 1970s. In Sweden, in other Scandinavian countries, we actually, until 1980s, 1990s, we have growing economies. They were growing somehow. So, and in the left community, it was ascribed to this favorable influence of the welfare state. But scholars who looked into this Swedish Scandinavian experiment, they argued that much of the wealth in Scandinavian countries was actually created before the 1950s, 1960s, when the full-fledged welfare state was introduced. So society had created a lot of wealth. That is why the later governments, social democratic governments, had a lot of resources, a lot of wealth to spread around. Okay. They also point to a traditional Protestant work ethics, which, for example, did not exist or does not exist in southern European countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, Catholic countries. Okay. Germany, by the way, also a country with Lutheran work ethic. Okay, we also have to mention it. Not much, of course, work ethics in France because it's a traditionally Catholic country. So, because of traditional Protestant work ethics, a lot of wealth had been created. Education, total education, as early as 1600, 100% literacy. Northern Europe, especially Scandinavia, had been totally literate countries. Homogeneous ethnic population, so Sweden until 1980s, 1990s was a mono-ethnic country represented by Swedes, Denmark, Danes, Norway, Norwegian people. So there were no different ethnic groups. So the level of trust was very big because people belonged to the same ethnic community. They developed this trust in the government. Small country, small government. Literally houses were left unlocked. People had a big welfare state, but there was assumption that you should not milk the welfare state. You only resort to benefits in a time of need, and that was backed up by the traditional Protestant ethics in Scandinavian countries and Northern Europe in general. That's what scholars stress talking about so-called Scandinavian model or the Swedish model, that the level of trust was big and welfare state became possible because of this high level of trust in this Protestant culture. Okay. Public expenditures grew. Okay. In Sweden, for instance, they reached 70% GNP. Of course, I'm jumping ahead because we are going to talk about the crisis of welfare state. In 2002, it was reduced to 57%. They had to do it. The government had to do it. Okay. Because at some point the government realized there was no wealth to distribute. The economies were going down. But I'm jumping ahead here. Income tax reached grotesque proportions in Sweden. Managers, high managerial class 80%, middle class people 60%. At some point, I repeat, at some point in 1980s, it reached 75% middle class and working class people. Okay, very, very high. The assumption was that economy would be growing, people would not be abusing with the welfare state. That was the assumption. Everything would be fine. Okay. But unfortunately, for the profits of the welfare state in 1970s, 1980s, this welfare state started to suffocate economic development. Okay. In UK, for instance, taxation on businesses reached at some point 90%. So businesses were escaping. Like the major example, probably everybody heard about this famous band called the Beatles. Okay, everybody heard about this classical rock band, the Beatles. Okay, the Beatles had to escape to the United States because it was unbearable for them. 90% of what they earned went to the state. In Sweden, it was 70% of people's incomes. So working class people and the middle class people. So from paychecks. Originally, Sweden also tried to impose a huge tax on the businesses in 1970s especially. But all major businesses escaped from Sweden, and no new company was created in Sweden when they imposed huge corporate taxes on businesses. And what quickly Swiss did, they slashed the corporate taxes, but they left huge taxes on people's incomes. That's the irony of the situation. To the present day, in Sweden, which is praised by the left, we have a very interesting situation. I would like to emphasize this, which doesn't exist in England, in UK. In UK, to the present day, we still have a big taxes on businesses and on people's income checks. But in Sweden, in the 1990s, in the year 2000, what happened? They left a huge income taxes, 70% for workers, middle class people, but corporate taxes were slashed. So if you invested in the Swedish economy, if you had a big company, so your corporate tax became very low. In fact, it's 22%. And that's how money came back to Sweden. So that's the irony of the situation. So businesses, ironically, since 1990s, were backed up by social democratic government. Very much backed up. Okay. Unlike, for example, the United States, where both Republican and Democratic government had a relatively high corporate tax. It reached 35%. So recently, the government, currently existing government, slashed it down to, again, the same number, 22%. That's how money comes back to the United States. But Sweden actually was the first. Sweden, in 1990s, Social Democrats made the lowest corporate tax to lure back businesses back to country, but keeping high taxes on incomes checks. But in UK, they didn't do it. They still maintained high taxes on both corporate profits and on population in general. So that's sure way to stagnation. We also have another problem. In many social democratic countries, government regulated opening and closing hours for stores. In Germany, for instance, stores had to be closed at 5 or 6 o'clock, no later. So it's not allowed according to labor regulations. Saturday, Sunday, all major chain networks have to be closed. It would be a violation of existing codes if you keep your store open, okay? Unless it's some kind of family, small mom and pop business, okay? If as long as it's chain, let's say I saw when I was in Germany and Austria is also a social democratic state until recently. I like to go to Oldies. Remember Oldies? We do have in Memphis the cheapest food, cheapest items. Oldies were closed in Austria and Germany at 6 o'clock. That's it. And on Sunday, I couldn't buy anything in Oldies because it was closed. Also, another restrictions on house and rent. So you couldn't raise your rent up above a certain limit. So which suffocated real estate. Okay, so you couldn't do anything in real estate because you were limited by governmental regulations. So I just mentioned a few things which led to the stagnation of economies. So businesses were escaping from many European countries, from France, from Italy, from Sweden, from UK, from Germany. Businesses were escaping to other countries, to the United States, to Mexico, to later in 1980s, 1990s, to China, escaping all these regulations. And since the major revenues for these welfare states, social democratic welfare states, was taxes, income taxes and corporate taxes, so their source of revenue was exhausted. So no more revenues. Another problem was we are having less working age population. In all major European countries, the population was growing older. So which means, and people lived longer, which means what we call social security in the United States. In Europe, it 100% functioning system of benefits, pension, governmental pension. But less contribution was done into this pension fund, okay, because fewer people were of the working age. So to make a long story short, in 1970s, 1980s, in all major European countries, we have more older population than working population, which put a lot of pressure on their pension system, okay, and when welfare system benefits like unemployment insurance, health benefits, which were sponsored by the state, of course, in Europe, okay. Another dangerous thing which I copied, statistics, you can see it here. I checked the statistics in several writings by scholars who wrote on Swedish welfare state. It's a very dangerous trend. The existence of welfare state to some extent destroyed work ethics, work incentives. For example, in 1950s, there were 80% of Swedes, according to opinion polls, who totally disapproved those who milked the benefits. So who were cheating. You know, some people cheat. They claim benefits which they are not entitled to. So there's some people who do it. Okay, you cannot avoid this. So anyway, 80% of people in Sweden in 1950s were against this. But in 1990s, 50% said it wasn't okay, so which means the other half said it's okay. And one of the major incidents that eventually made editorials in Sweden and other countries was how frequently Swedes started to abuse so-called sick leaves. You know, they were unlimited until 2002. There were unlimited sick leaves in Sweden, so you could claim it as many times as you wanted by calling to your boss, to your workplace, said, oh, I'm sick, I have a flu, I scratched my leg, something, you know, I bumped my head, so I'm a little bit dizzy, so let me claim like 2 days, okay, and they wrote it for you. So they trusted you because everything was based on trust. So what we have during the major soccer games, during the major hockey games, especially when international teams were involved, Sweden in 1980s, 1990s started suddenly to experience the epidemic of sick leaves. So which shows that It was total fraud. In fact, Swedes who live a long life, the life expectancy one of the longest in the world in Sweden. Only Japan can beat Sweden. In Japan, old people live until 98, 95. It's average. Okay, so Swedes, like Japanese people, live until 91, 92. But Swedes, by statistics, became the most unhealthy people in the world if you take into consideration the number of sick leaves they took, which revealed the total fraud. So, and eventually, of course, the government had to step in and to eliminate this loophole. So the number of sick leaves you could take was drastically reduced in 2002. And again, I did not have before this bullet point, but 3 hours later, when 3 hours before I did this presentation, I kind of, at the last moment, I threw this in. I don't know what you think about it. So during this corona pandemic, so when the government suddenly threw to my account $1,200, you know, I was happy, of course, to get this free money, you know, so I didn't send it back. But at the same time, I asked my questions. So why did I get this money? For what? I was not an unemployed person. Of course, if I had been unemployed or if I had been furloughed, I could have told myself, yes, it's justified. Yes, it's correct. You know, I don't have any income. I'm in a desperate state. I was laid off because of this epidemic and blah, blah, blah. So what? Yeah, I'm totally entitled to this money, $1,200. But I kept receiving my paycheck each month, same number, and then suddenly government sends me 1,200. So maybe I don't understand something, you know. I will, in case we have some Zoom meeting, so I will appreciate your opinion about how can you rationalize for me, so Andrei Znamensky, been entitled to this money. So am I entitled to this money or not? Maybe I missed something. Maybe I was entitled to this money. So I'm just curious, you know. I don't have any explanation for this. Maybe I shouldn't include it, you know. Some kind of half of me didn't want to include this, to relate it somehow, this number 1,200, to what's going on right now. But at the same time, I did include it. So I would like you to discuss as how it might affect my work ethics, for instance, this free money out of the blue, you know, to my checking account. Anyway, let's move on. Okay. So what I mentioned, by the way, about the Swedish state, which maintained a huge income tax, up to 70% of general income checks of middle class people and working class people. At the same time, slashing corporate taxes was the example of corporate welfare. So the Swedish state created a favorable environment for the corporations, inviting money back. Okay. So when we talk about welfare state, we also have to talk about the corporate welfare, which in case of Sweden did work out. And again, businesses which had escaped in 1970s, 1980s, then came back because corporate taxes were slashed down to what, 22? But check the number. I don't remember exact number. I think it's 22%. Corporate taxes, very low, lowest taxes in the world, corporate taxes in Sweden. Okay. But at the same time, corporate welfare might work, might be detrimental. Okay, for example, in the United States, we have examples of corporate welfare when Google, for instance, Google and internet companies that took advantage of Communication Decency Act 1996. If you don't know what it means, I want to explain to you. This is a special act that waived any legal litigations against internet companies if they publish something which other people didn't like. Basically, the Act of 1996 made internet companies immune to any litigation. So you couldn't sue them, okay? If you disagreed, for instance, if your account has been removed, your website has been removed or something, you cannot sue Google, okay? You cannot sue YouTube, you cannot sue Facebook, okay? So in this act, they stress that internet startups, see, the original goal was to support internet startups, to kind of promote development of this internet economy. So obviously it was a progressive thing to do at that time. But later, when Google, Facebook, and YouTube, which belongs to Google, as you know, they became huge companies, monopolies, they took advantage of this situation because no person could sue them, okay? For example, you can sue CNN, you can sue New York Times if they publish something, you know, like some kind of lie, you know, like Fox News. If they publish something which is supposedly outrageous lie, so basically if you have enough resources, you can sue them. But you cannot sue Google because Google, Facebook, and other internet companies, they're considered platforms, okay, platforms like Verizon, T-Mobile, okay. You cannot sue Verizon, T-Mobile if somebody has a bad phone conversation which you don't like. You don't sue Verizon by saying, oh, such and such person had this very kind of intimidating terrorist conversation over the phone, so I want this person to waive his phone number, okay, eliminate his phone account with you, like T-Mobile or AT&T. So it's not done this way, right? But it's not the case in the case of Google, in YouTube, Facebook. Basically, big companies, big monopolies use this corporate welfare to what? To promote the monopoly presence. Okay, since nobody can sue them, they take advantage of their monopoly status. Okay, because one of the major tools to control behavior of people who want to be bad, so to speak, is a threat of litigation. So people are afraid to be sued, right? You live in the United States, everybody is afraid to be sued, right? Doctors, whatever, universities, everybody is afraid to be sued. But in this case, according to this act, internet companies are not afraid to be sued because they cannot be sued. And as you know, 2 days ago, Department of Justice initiated, according to anti-monopoly legislation, a huge legal case against Google, okay, trying to break this welfare, corporate welfare. See, the state had created in the first place this monopoly perk, and now the state comes back again to kind of eradicate what the same state had originally created. I'm just giving you this example as the example of most recent example of corporate welfare, when the state itself later has to come to eradicate this case of corporate welfare. So another trait of crisis of the welfare state was the growth of bureaucratic regulatory machine, which was promoted by social democratic governments in Western Europe. Okay, society and economy became so complex, you need to decentralize decision making. But unfortunately, in many European countries and partially in the United States, although in the United States we have federalism, which mutes this centralization drive, for rightly so. So in case of European countries, the bureaucratic regulatory machine became so big that it was another reason why many businesses escaped from these countries to other countries. And another thing, 1990s, year 2000, we have a huge immigration from third world countries, immigration to these prosperous countries, which had generous welfare state, which immigrants wanted to take advantage, okay, because a lot of them were not only escaping from their countries as political asylum seekers, but also, and it was natural for them, they were economic immigrants who wanted to move to Western countries to have a good life, and you cannot blame them for this. But little did they know, these countries, Western Europe, that it would put a huge pressure on the welfare state, because the assumption of these people who lived in and used the welfare state in Sweden, Swedes, in Germany, Germans, okay, in England, British, the assumption was that people would resort to welfare benefits only in case of need, right? And it would serve only this particular ethnic group. But now you have 1,000 immigrants who come, and some of them come from a dirt poor countries, and they try to quickly take advantage of welfare benefits, and which creates the breeding ground for nationalism, because some segments of population in Western European countries, they assume that, oh, it's only for us. That was the assumption, okay? And when other people come and use the same benefits, they become very jealous, okay? This natural jealousy. And there we have a competition for welfare benefits. And that's how you have this growth of, huge growth of nationalist parties in Western Europe, which Europe never seen in the post-war world. Until 1990s, there were hardly any nationalistic parties in Europe, but now it's everywhere. It's everywhere. This anti-immigration parties in Germany, in Sweden, very, very much popular. And it's another thing which I want to mention: the political influence of Social Democrats was going down. In 1990s, 2000, and to the present day, their popularity was going down. To whom they were losing? To whom did they lose? Social Democrats, primarily to two political forces. First, to those political forces that promoted classical liberalism, so free market, okay, who wanted to eliminate regulation, the big state. And the second, two nationalists, whom I just mentioned, who anti-immigrants parties. So these two forces, on the one hand, the free marketeers, represented by, see, in Europe they call it liberalism, classical liberalism, what in the United States we call libertarianism, so please be aware of this. So in Europe, Social Democrats were losing to some libertarian-minded people and to nationalists who were against immigration, who wanted to shut down. And in fact, they did in Sweden in 2015. Eventually, they were able to crack down on immigration. But we're talking about the welfare state, about the Social Democrats. So Social Democrats were losing. Well, they were losing. And let me give you some numbers. For example, in Sweden, we're talking about Sweden, 1991, for the first time since 1932, the share of the vote in Sweden accumulated by Social Democrats dropped below 40%, below 40%. So until 1991, it was 50%. So half of the population always voted Social Democrats. For the first time in 1991, only 40%. So 10% drop. Less and less, fewer and fewer workers supported Social Democrats. So they switch their votes. I'm sorry, they switch their votes to either nationalists or they stopped going to vote. So many of them, many workers who supported Social Democrats, they start not openly, of course, they because of some extent of self-censorship and public censorship in Sweden. Some workers don't mention it openly, but when they come to a voting booth, some of them, the significant segment of them, started voting nationalist. Okay. For example, in Sweden, a party named New Democracy, for the first time, which represented interest of this nationalist segment, some workers came to vote for this party. Accumulated was able during parliamentary elections to receive 6.7% of the votes and received 25 seats in the Swedish parliament. Okay. Classical liberals, who call themselves liberals, almost tripled its share. So people who defend, they're not nationalists, but they defended free market. Their number of votes they received tremendously increased. For example, by 1998, the number of people who voted for this Liberal Party increased from 4.7% to 13%. Tripled. Okay. So throughout the 1990s, from 4.7 to 13%. So that's the data. So right now, for example, we have a welfare state having this precarious existence in Scandinavian countries. In UK, there are debates to what are the limits of the welfare state. So how far we should have, how far we should go in this direction, because it was clear that at some point it started to suffocate economic incentives. Majority of people understand that they should have this. In Europe, it is still popular, but to what extent and who should contribute, who should take advantage of this welfare state? So the debates are still going on, but the fact of life is that Social Democrats have been losing their presence in the political spectrum. The so-called third way, which had been promoted by Bernstein, by Clement Atlee, by Myrdals, now experiencing this crisis. And which way this crisis will go, I don't know. With some of these countries might switch more to nationalism, although I doubt that too much, because traditionally these democratic regimes in Western Europe, they're very much tolerant, that I doubt that the majority of population would go nationalistic. So most probably we would have this transformation in the direction of some free market, okay, less regulation. So it's essentially we're talking about trimming, cutting some welfare state, but nobody talks today about total elimination of welfare state. So that's what I would like to mention, that in Western Europe still the majority of society still support this welfare state. Again, the situation of course might change if the majority of society would go against this, but so far I didn't see this trend. Okay, anyway, that's the state of things about Western, particularly European social democracy. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.